So before we really get into the various factors, one of the first things to consider is this idea of altruistic personalities, and this refers to certain qualities, especially personality differences, that cause certain individuals to help others in a wide variety of situations as opposed to only in specific situations. Now, while it is true that there are certain people who have sort of dispositional traits that make them more likely to help than others, these traits can oftentimes be easily and readily overridden by the current situational or societal context that that person finds themselves in. We'll talk about this later, but there is a well-known study that shows that even people who are training to become sort of good and moral people as part of a certain clergy will tend to overlook people in need of help when they are late to a certain assignment as opposed to when they have time to offer aid. And the degree to which someone is either late or not can have a dramatic impact on how likely they are to help. We find similar contexts or events where people tend to be either very tired or stressed out. Both of these things tend to reduce the degree to which people will tend to help. So while it is true that there are certain people who seem to be more likely to help than others, oftentimes the situation is a large and powerful determinant of whether we will help or not. And so by itself, personality is not enough to determine if a person will likely render aid or not. One of the first types of individual differences to talk about when it comes to prosocial behavior is differences in helping behaviors by gender. And when we're talking about the aggregate number of helping behaviors, so overall, let's say if you counted how many helping behaviors were conferred by men and how many were conferred by women, and ultimately we don't have much information on those who identify as non-binary or not in this direct binary spectrum. We really only have data right now for men and women in this context. But anyhow, when you divide this across sort of just numbers of helping behaviors, there's not a dramatic difference across gender, where both men and women tend to help others at about the same number of helping behaviors. Looking at this more closely, however, there are strong differences in the type of helping behaviors that are given or conferred by men and women. And these types of behaviors are largely moderated by the societal norms that exist for each gender. And by moderated, I just mean that the societal norms has a dramatic impact on the type of helping behaviors that people are likely to give to others. And ultimately, societies have different norms about what actions and behaviors are acceptable for both men and women, and this pressure will largely determine the types of helping behaviors given. So for example, in many cultures, including here in the United States, oftentimes men are considered to be more physically strong and they're required to be more chivalrous, whereas women are oftentimes put into a more demure and sort of communal role. And not that they're actually like this other than just societal upbringing, but this society's pressure tends to shape what types of helping behaviors they will tend to give. And so oftentimes one finds that here, for example, in the United States, that men will be much more likely to give help when something requires either physical effort or could be dangerous to the body, whereas women will tend to give much more help when there is some social discord or something that requires some type of relational management or care. And please just note that this has nothing to do with whether one gender is better at certain types of helping behavior than another, but largely these are just due to the societal norms. And excuse me, when it is different or divergent from this, oftentimes even though these are positive behaviors whereby people are helping, the people who helped and violated their societal norms can actually face ridicule from their environments, which is just unfortunately one of the drawbacks of having these types of norms. When it comes to cultural differences, so cultural differences tend to make a fairly... Another thing that's really important to consider when we're talking about cultural differences is whether people are likely to help those of their own culture versus people of some other culture. And it need not be a divide across culture, it can actually apply to any type of group. So just as a refresher of types of these groups, in-groups refer to any groups to which we identify as being a member. So this could be anything from I'm part of a chess club, let's say, to I identify as a man. And so in one case, the people who are part of this chess group are my in-group, along with all people who identify as men are also part of my in-group in this context. Whereas out-groups are any groups that are to which I do not subscribe my membership. So people who hunt, for example, would be not my in-group because I'm not somebody who goes hunting. Or people who identify as women are different than how I identify, and so they would technically classify as an out-group. So it need not just be that I am currently a United States citizen and therefore Canadians are my out-group. Technically, yes, that is also the case, but it need not be based on sovereign nations. It is any type of group to which we identify. Now, on average, people will tend to help their in-group members at a higher rate than they will help their out-group members. And this is just something that has been well documented across the literature and over time. And now, another very important part to consider in this is that oftentimes, even though we will help out-group members, the reasons for which we help out-group members are often quite different than the reasons for which we help our in-group members. Now, when we talked about the empathy and then social exchange theories, when we are empathizing with people, we are less likely to pay attention to the benefits and costs in regard to helping those people. Another parallel to this is that our in-group members tend to evoke higher degrees of empathy from us than our out-group members. And so we actually are more likely to help our in-group members just for the sake of helping them and for no other sort of pros and cons that we could get from it. Now, out-group members evoke much less empathy from us, and so we're actually much more inclined to begin to pay attention to the costs and benefits associated with helping these members who are not of our in-groups. And so one finds this a lot of the times with charity, and so I don't mean to knock on people who give to charity because ultimately it is a good and vital service that people provide, but a lot of times people provide to charities to either assuage something that they themselves are carrying or because it makes them look good in the eyes of their current social group, because generally speaking, donating to charity is considered to be a moral and good thing, and while one can do it just for the sake of being a good person, oftentimes one reaps tremendous benefits from being a good person so long as other people know that you are doing these good things. And just to see how strong these types of subtle impacts can be, while we don't have many cases where you could sit at a coffee shop now and watch people put money in a tip jar, you will notice that overwhelmingly people will put tip into the jar when the person behind the counter is looking at them and not when they're actually looking away. And now there could be many reasons for this, but at the end of the day, the reasons by which we do things are not always the reasons why we actually did them in the first place. And yes, someone could say, well, I want them to know that I did this and not that I just left, but why do you care one way or another? What is it that one is reaping then from receiving this acknowledgement that you have left a little bit of additional money? If it was purely for altruistic reasons, why should it make a difference that you have given a little bit above and beyond? Another thing that comes up a lot when we're talking about prosocial behaviors is religion. And perhaps one of the most common schemas across the world is that people who are religious are more likely to help than those who are not religious. One sees a parallel of this in morality. For example, one thing that is oftentimes thrown towards atheists, even though atheism is also a belief just like any of the others, a lot of times people have this idea that if you do not believe in a god or deity or pantheon of some sort, how can you be a moral person? And so in this same way, people tend to believe that those who subscribe to some type of particular religious faith are more likely to help others than people who are not of a specific religious faith. Now, this schema is ultimately complicated. Yes, people do tend to help quite a bit when they are religious, but there's a sort of strong caveat to this of why this appears to be the case, and when empirically investigated, it's not necessarily true that people who are religious actually help more on average than people who are not. So first of all, people who are religious are more inclined to help people who are of the same religion as them as compared to people who are either non-religious or of a different religious faith. And this ultimately falls again in line with how we were talking about in-groups and out-groups. Further, people who are religious tend to spend much more time out of their own days and lives with people who share the same faith as them, as opposed to people who are of different faiths than them. And this leads to much more opportunity for which they can help others because they are perpetually with their in-group. Well, maybe not perpetually, but at higher rates. Now, it should be noted that this is not something unique to religious people. At the end of the day, most human beings will tend to congregate and spend more time with their in-groups than with their out-groups. And you might, of course, think to yourself, well, I have lots of out-group member friends, and that might well be the case for you. Remember that when we are talking about this type of stuff from an empirical lens, we are oftentimes talking about averages and aggregates and majorities, and there will always be exceptions to these rules. But at the end of the day, the trend is by and large that people who are like tend to be together as opposed to people who are opposites. And this just increases the odds at which these people will tend to help each other out. Empirically speaking, if you are just looking at people helping random other strangers with no other knowledge, in those cases, religious people are no more or less likely to help than just an average person who does not follow a certain specific religious denomination. Finally, something that influences whether we will help or not quite dramatically actually is the mood in which we are in. So first looking at good moods, as one might expect, when people are in a positive mood, they are much more likely to engage in prosocial behaviors than at almost any other time. Well, compared to their mood situations at least. And this happens for a number of reasons. The first is probably a positivity bias that ultimately causes us to look at the world in a more positive light, and we tend to be more optimistic about both our own actions and interventions, along with how we tend to view or judge other people. Oftentimes, when people think about whether they could help someone or not, and they're not maybe in a good mood, they will at least consider, even if they help anyway, that the person will either be ungrateful, they won't take advantage of this, they will use the resources for something that won't actually help them, so on and so forth. And many of these thoughts come to our minds when we are wanting to help other people out. But when we are in a good mood, we will tend to be more optimistic about the outcomes of our helping behaviors, and thus are more likely to engage in those behaviors. Another reason why positive mood seems to affect the rate at which we help is very ultimately selfish or self-oriented, and this is that when we are helping other people, it tends to bolster our mood. And so even if you weren't feeling so good and you helped other people, chances are this would put you into a good mood. Now, it is next to impossible to maintain a good mood all the time, and it requires a degree of maintenance in order to sort of keep that mood level up. And so helping other people is one of the most surefire ways to maintain having a positive mood, and this can ultimately lead to an interesting set of feedback mechanisms through which you're more inclined to help other people when you're feeling good, and then you will also continue to help people because it will allow you to maintain that positive mood, thus making it again more likely for you to help people, and this can ultimately lead to a nice sort of self-perpetuating loop of positive mood. Of course, this is not to say that you can just do this forever because a person can become exhausted or stretched too thin, and there are many other factors that ultimately affect our moods. A third factor, though this will only depend on, or it requires people who subscribe to sort of norms of egalitarianism or the fact that altruism is a good idea to have, or that their moral responsibility is to help other people, or when they carry similar types of norms. In these types of cases, it has been shown that being in a positive mood will actually increase the degree of attention that we pay to ourselves. And just like when we talked about self-focus, this increased attention devoted to ourselves is more likely to bring our values and mores and norms to the forefront of our minds. And this sort of foregrounding of our beliefs is what then allows us to help at a higher rate if those beliefs tend to include things like helping other people is a good thing to do. If a person does not have those types of norms, then them being in a positive mood actually won't increase their helping behaviors along this mechanism. Now, a common misconception actually when we come to bad moods is that they will actually prevent us or lower the rates of us helping. And this turns out actually not to be the case for many of them. In fact, especially when it comes to sadness and guilt, people are actually more likely to help others. For sadness, this is primarily due to the reason of when we do help other people, it actually increases our mood or the goodness of our mood, let's say. And when we are feeling guilt, this is oftentimes quite an aversive feeling, and we can assuage that guilt by helping other people because it allows us to, at least in our own minds much of the time, balance the moral scales through which we were found wanting and thus feeling guilt. And so when one is feeling guilty, one can actually increase the rates of prosocial behaviors. Now, there might not be as much as when we are in a good mood, but there are definitely more than when we are in either neutral or apathetic moods. Just as a extra piece here, there's actually some literature that speaks to the idea that even certain states of anger will actually increase the rate at which we will help others. And the way that they're making this distinction between certain states of anger is occasionally we're just angry directed at a specific person, which is unlikely to increase the rate at which we will help that person. But sometimes we are angry at the injustice of a system, which is also ultimately anger. And that anger can actually drive us into actions that are largely pro-social for either our community, our kin, or even society at large. And so the relationship between emotions and mood and whether we will help, especially when it comes to the more negative ones, is actually quite complex. Just to end with some empirical context to show how a bump to our positive mood can lead to an increased rate of helping. So here's a paper by Eisen and Levin in 1972. And we're talking about the second study in this paper because that is the one that is referenced by your textbook. So in this particular study, there were 41 participants, 24 of whom identified as female, 17 who identified as male. Now, this study was conducted when phone booths were still a thing. And just in case you are unfamiliar with what a phone booth is, before cell phones became common, they were these little glass boxes into which you could walk and stand, and then there was a payphone inside. And the way these payphones worked is you would put some change in them, and you'd pick it up and you'd dial a phone number. And you could then talk to this person, assuming you had put enough money into the phone. And if you ran out, you could always just add some more, just like a parking meter. And if you got done with your phone call and hadn't used all of the money up, there was a little slot that would deposit the remainder of your change, and you could then take your change and you could walk out. And just in case you've ever wondered what pagers oftentimes got used for and someone needed to call someone back, you could page someone with the phone number that was stamped on the top of a phone booth, and they could actually call you at that phone booth. Of course, it could lead to all kinds of random situations where people who weren't meant to answer the phone call pick up the phone booth. Anyhow, the way this experiment was set up, they were ultimately two experimental accomplices, and what they did is the first one would either place a dime in the coin return slot or they would not, and this was done randomly. The second accomplice was standing close to the phone booth looking in a department store window, and they were using the reflection in the window to examine when someone went into the phone booth, how long they spent on the phone, and they waited until they were just about to leave. Right when they were about to leave the phone booth, this second accomplice, who was carrying a folder full of papers, would walk past the phone booth right outside the door and then accidentally drop all of their papers. And once they did this, they wanted to see how many people would ultimately help them pick up all their papers. Now, a quick note before we talk about the results. If people were in the condition where a dime was left in the phone booth, and they did not look for it or did not find it, these people were excluded from consideration in this experiment. Second, while it might not seem like a lot to you to find a dime somewhere, at the end of the day, even finding a little bit of money, say finding $1 on the street today, will tend to give us a boost to our positive mood because most people tend to like finding some free money lying around, even if it's not going to make us happy for all eternity, and even if it is not millions of dollars. In fact, For many people, it's probably easier for them to keep a dollar that they find than if they find $1 million because of all the weird thoughts that would be associated to a suitcase full of money just lying there on the street. Anyhow, back to the results. The expectation here was that those who found the dime would have received a boost to their positive mood and would be more likely to help out than those who did not find the dime. Now, here in the results, you can see that this is split by those who identify as female and those who identify as male. For those who identified as female, when they found the dime, you can find of all 8 people who were in this condition, all 8 of them helped, versus when they were in the no dime condition, meaning they didn't find it, out of the 16 people who were in that condition, none of them helped. Now, when you had people who identified as male, you find pretty much the same pattern, where when those who found the dime and received a boost to their positive mood, 6 out of the 8 individuals in that condition tended to help, whereas you see the opposite pattern when no dime was found, that out of the 9 individuals, only 1 of them helped. Now, the reason that these two are split is because the second accomplice who dropped the papers was someone who identified as female, and they just wanted to be able to examine both of these to see if there were any strong gender effects based on who was giving help and who was receiving help. At the end of the day, though, this has been replicated many times, of course, no longer with phone booths, but oftentimes this is done in today's world by giving people personality tests and telling them that they're more interesting than average, they seem like they're very good-natured or have all kinds of other positive dispositions. And actually, there are all kinds of different ways to bolster people's positive mood. And reliably, one tends to find that whenever positive mood is sort of buffered, people will be more likely to help strangers than when the mood is not buffered.